Homer's Odyssey has the perfect, cathartic, and emotionally fulfilling ending for an epic about a man's return home. The only problem is, this ending occurs 624 lines before the final words. This has puzzled readers and scholars alike for over 2,000 years. And it's something that I had at the forefront of my mind when I went to see the new Nolan movie. I was keen to see how he was going to handle it. So here's my take on Homer's ending and Nolan's. Welcome to Ancient Classics. There will be spoilers for Homer's epic throughout this video, but I'll give fair warning ahead of any movie-specific spoilers. So don't worry if you're familiar with the epic but not yet seen the movie. And by the way, do see the movie, it's really good. After 20 years away at war and on his mystic adventures, Odysseus is finally home. He's re-established himself as the master of his household, purged his palace of rivals and traitors, and finally reveals himself to and is recognized and accepted by his wife Penelope. Their relationship is rightly celebrated as one of the most profound in the entirety of literature. Some, naively perhaps, say that Penelope is the ideal, patient, faithful wife and Odysseus the devoted husband who will endure anything to come back to the woman he loves. Others might see them as playing a long, manipulative, but erotically charged dance of deceit across continents and decades. Either which way, they are each other's perfect match. And thus reunited, they go to bed. And they go to bed at line 296 of Book 23 of 24. And in my Loeb edition at least, Book 23 has 372 lines, and Book 24, 548. To modern readers, and it seems to the ancients too, those remaining 624 lines can seem like a bit of an anticlimax. Some scenes feel duplicative of earlier ones, or just downright clumsy and pointless. First, Odysseus and Penelope recap their own stories, which is just bizarre, with Odysseus telling Penelope about all the goddesses he's shagged over the years. Then they start discussing practical logistical plans about how Odysseus is going to replenish his resources, through piracy of course. Then we have an underworld scene, the second in the epic, with cameos from dead heroes reflecting yet again on the troubles of the returning Achaeans, as if we didn't already know. And then there's a reunion between Odysseus and his dad Laertes, including yet another trick identity reveal. Then we get to see how the dead suitors' families are all annoyed because Odysseus killed everyone, and then there's another discussion between the gods about what to do with Odysseus, and then a battle between the retainers of the dead suitors' families and Odysseus. Athene comes down to tell them to put aside their differences. The Avengers back off, but Odysseus is still up for a scrap, so Odysseus launches a thunderbolt, narrowly missing his daughter Athene, who, lightning slapped by Daddy, tells Odysseus he better chill the f*** out. Odysseus relents, and then a formal peace treaty is brokered by Athene in the guise of mentor. I'm sorry to say so, but it's a drag. Compare this to the Iliad. Yes, the end of the Iliad takes place 2 books after Achilles' climactic showdown with Hector, but the final book of the Iliad contains perhaps its most emotionally devastating and cathartic scenes. After his and everyone else's life up, all because of an insult. And after losing his best friend Patroclus and slaying the killer Hector, Achilles has to confront Hector's grieving father Priam face to face, man to man. And then in a compact and brief ending scene, the emotional scope suddenly pans out to an entire community, as Hector's body is brought home and cremated before his wife Andromache and the grieving townsfolk of Troy. And we know that everyone involved in those final scenes, Achilles, Priam, Andromache alike, will soon all be dead or enslaved. It's absolutely devastating. Compare that to Athene coming down from Olympus and saying, "Hey guys, enough already. Kiss and make up, y'all." Thunderbolt. Naughty boy. Shake hands, everyone. The end. So what's going on? Well, it seemed to puzzle the ancients. There are 2 oft-cited scholiast notes at Book 23, line 296, being the point when Odysseus and Penelope go to bed. Aristophanes, not the comic playwright, and Aristarchos make this the end, Peras, of the Odyssey. Or, alternatively, Aristarchos and Aristophanes say that this is the end, telos, of the Odyssey. There's a debate to be had as to what Aristophanes and Aristarchos meant by this, largely because of the range of potential meanings of the Greek telos and peras, and indeed the English meaning of the words ends too. they might have been making the observation that the bed scene is the end of the key plot, the emotional climax, which is something I think many of us would agree with today. And this also ties in with Aristotle's comment that the logos of the Odyssey, i.e. perhaps the main plot, is not long. A guy's away from home for many years, while Poseidon watches over him. He arrives, saves himself, and kills his enemies. That's the main idea, and the rest is just episodes. By which Aristotle is arguably saying that the logos, the main story or the plot, however you're going to translate it, ends with the slaying of the suitors, and the rest is just mere episodi, or whatever that means. Alternatively, Aristophanes and Aristarchos might have been claiming that the bed scene was literally the final bit of the epic in its earlier state, and that some incompetent hack extended it. You can bet scholars have explored both views over the centuries, and things get really technical and philological at that point. Me, I'm just going to shrug and say, hey, who knows? But nonetheless, what's clear to me is that those final 624 lines after Odysseus and Penelope go to bed are never cut from modern editions, so far as I'm aware. So my stance is this: I'm going to accept those final 624 lines as part of our Odyssey, such as it is. The question then becomes, what's the point of those extra lines? Are they any good? Are they useful to have? Or is it all just a very suboptimal end to an otherwise great epic? Now, perhaps you might speculate whoever wrote the end was some tiresome completionist who just couldn't allow any loose threads to remain, and so had to take it to the end of Odysseus' story. But that's demonstrably not the case. The Odyssey already foreshadows several events to follow before Odysseus can finally rest. He must replenish his wealth through piracy, and more significantly, he must go on a final mythic quest of atonement, traveling inland to a place where people mistake an oar for a winnowing fan and sacrifice to Poseidon before he returns home. All this has been foretold by the dead prophet Tiresias, and is repeated by Odysseus in the Odyssey itself. And that's leaving aside the alternative post-Odyssean adventures from the lost cyclic epic, the Telegony. So it's not mere completionism. What is achieved by the final book or so? Emotionally and dramatically, maybe not that much, at least not in my opinion. And if you would disagree with me, and if you really love the ending of the Odyssey, then please do give your thoughts in the comments. Even so, thematically and structurally, the ending does have its value. On a superficial level, the last 600 odd lines ensure that the Odyssey have 24 books like the Iliad, and that's an even number, which is good, although the book divisions probably post-date the earliest written versions anyway, so that doesn't really count for much. The ending does introduce a certain level of ring composition, and we know the ancients loved their ring compositions. The Odyssey begins, after the proem, with a council of gods and ends, if not with a full council, at least with a deliberation between Zeus and Athene, just before Athene goes back down to mediate a truce. But the ending also allows Odysseus to reunite with his father Laertes, and brings 3 generations of men, Laertes, Odysseus, and Telemachus, together for a final, albeit halted, epic battle. For an epic whose very first word is andra, man, and is all about a man's return and reintegration into society, and with it the continuation of patrilineal power, having the 3 generations of men together is quite an important motif. Think about it. Laertes couldn't be introduced in the poem any earlier than he is. He had to be kept off scene until after Odysseus had dealt with the suitors. If he'd been hanging around the palace, the obvious question would have been, why isn't Laertes dealing with everything? What kind of a man is he? And conversely, if Laertes were present, but in command at the palace, that would have undermined Odysseus' role. It would have meant that Odysseus could never have re-established himself without effectively usurping his own father. So Laertes is necessarily kept off scene in retirement right until the end. Something similar, but from the kind of the other generational perspective, is happening with Telemachus, albeit that he enters much earlier on, before in fact we even meet Odysseus proper. At the start of the Odyssey, Telemachus is still young. He's present in the palace and tolerated by the suitors, perhaps because he is not yet a threat to them in much the same way as Laertes has to be kept off scene in retirement. In the first few books, under Athene's guidance, we see Telemachus mature and begin to take on his role as heir to Odysseus. And it's surely no coincidence that as soon as he first sets off on his own and goes on his mini quest for news of Odysseus, well, that's when the suitors start hatching a plan to assassinate him, because he's about to become the man of the house. Telemachus and Odysseus, father and son, team up almost as soon as Odysseus lands back in Ithaca, and together with the faithful Eumaeus and pals, they deal with the suitors. Again, Laertes has no place in that showdown with the suitors unless he is to overshadow his son, Odysseus, in a way that Telemachus never does as the heir in waiting. And yet once the immediate threat within the palace is dealt with, once Odysseus has re-established himself at home and in the marriage, then, and only then, can Odysseus reunite with his father. Indeed, one of the better aspects of the final book is seeing the three generations of men fighting together, and one of the more touching lines in the whole epic, actually, comes at line 514 to 15 of book 24, when Laertes, watching his son and grandson bicker over who's going to kick the most ass, proudly declares, "What a day this is for me. By the dear gods, I'm so happy. My son and grandson are having a quarrel over their bravery." And indeed, Laertes gets involved in the action too, killing a man, the father of the suitor Antinous, a neat little bit of symmetry there, before of course the battle is quelled by Athene. All this has to happen, by my reckoning, after Odysseus and Penelope go to bed. You could say that it's the patriarchal oikos and the patrilineal dynasty themes taking ultimate structural and artistic precedence over the romantic elements of the plot. We might find that a bit anticlimactic in modern times, but hey, Homer's entitled to set his priorities as he sees fit. And I see this also as being all tied in with the deep folkloric and socio-political themes of this culturally foundational epic. Because on that theme, folklore, politics, society, the ending serves to resolve, necessarily but perhaps crudely, a very real problem for Homer, namely blood feuds, vengeance and vendetta, things that can only be resolved for him with the deus ex machina. Side note, we all know about the deus ex machina trope, God from the machine, conventionally traced back to those Greek tragedies where an actor playing a god or goddess would literally be brought into view by a crane or other contraption in order to resolve a drama. It's clunky and unsatisfying by our modern reckoning, but that didn't stop Euripides and his peers, nor indeed Homer. You see, Athene's role coming down from Olympus and Zeus's thunderbolt, both ending the final encounter, that's, you could say, a direct precursor to the deus ex machina trope, which is neat in literary historical terms, but even so we need to consider whether and why the trope is necessary here. And on reflection, I think it is necessary. Odysseus has to kill the suitors. The whole plot of the Odyssey up to book 22 makes their slaughter necessary and inevitable. Likely, although I'm speculating, the slaughter of the suitors was perhaps also a key feature of the traditions upon which the Odyssey was built and which Homer just had to integrate and deal with. We know too well from modern societies as much as ancient that the slaying of others from within one's community is never the final act. A cycle of vengeance and retribution is inevitable. Either that or exile. Exile of the very man who's supposed to be returning home. Now, this is no mere anthropological theory, because Odysseus himself knows this reality, and he even says so. When someone kills just one man in society, even one who leaves few behind to avenge him, then that killer must go into exile, leaving behind his kin and homeland. And yet we have killed the very pillars of this community, the best young men in Ithaca. So there can be no true homecoming, no closure for Odysseus absent divine intervention. Athene must come down to stop the fight and broker a peace treaty. And before that, Zeus himself must ordain a kind of forgetfulness or divinely mandated absolution, as Zeus himself declares. Since Odysseus has had his revenge on the suitors, the people must swear oaths, and then Odysseus can rule forevermore. I'll see to it that there is forgetfulness for the slaughter of so many sons and brothers, and then all will live civilly with one another as before. So let there be an abundance of peace and prosperity once more. There was no other way out for Homer. His only options would have been to ignore the problem of the cycles of vengeance altogether, which would have struck his audience as hopelessly unrealistic, or to leave Odysseus' homecoming fundamentally incomplete and flawed. Athene and Zeus's final interventions are to that extent inelegant and clunky, but entirely necessary according to folkloric and cultural logic. Or to quote Lonie in his study of vengeance motifs in the Odyssey, thus the poet ends with this extreme effort to provide closure. This is in fact the only conclusion as such it could have had, for our Odyssey has throughout shown that Tissy's vengeance breeds endless further plots, making an epic of revenge fatally open-ended. Even the extreme violence of the general indiscriminate slaughter of the suitors was not enough. To come to an end, the poem needed to obliterate the memory of Tisys as well. Such a conclusion is only possible through divine fiat. The artifice of this ending and its radical disjunction from the rest of the plot are thus integral to the poet's project and the poem as a whole. The last scene of the Odyssey reveals the instability of an epic that ends in revenge. Now, modern audiences and critics tend to hate Deus Ex Machina endings, and for good reason, but perhaps they weren't so cliched in Homer's time. I mean, literally, the machina hadn't been invented. Besides, Athene's intervention is not extraneous to the plot, as the worst instances of Deus Ex Machina tropes are. She has been involved all along, ever since Book 1. And again, her final involvement, especially where she brokers the peace treaty in the guise of mentor, is another instance of the ring compositional aspects that I mentioned before. Now, since I am pivoting now into a pop culture vein, Nolan coming up soon, I think it's also worth noting that there are some superficial similarities, I feel, to the cadence of the final 600 odd lines and the ending of the Lord of the Rings, with that whole scouring of the Shire episode. It's been decades since I've read the book, so I'm not going to go any deeper than that, and I'm sure some of your memories will be fresher here, so I'll leave it to you all to post in the comments section to compare and contrast the post-Penelope reunion Odysseus and the post-ring-melting Frodo. As for the Lord of the Ring movies, I also haven't watched them since, I think, the mid-2000s, but if I recall correctly, okay, I cheated and looked it up, Peter Jackson chose to cut the scouring scene from The Return of the King. So, this brings us to the question, how does Nolan deal with the end? As I write this script, I'm about to pop on down to the cinema, and I'll continue on my return. Okay, I'm back. Well, actually, I'm reading this all from the script the next day, but you know what I mean. So here's your spoiler warning. I repeat, massive movie spoilers coming up now. As I write this, it's 10:30 p.m, Friday the 17th of July. Just cracked open a beer, and I'm about to download my immediate, unfiltered reaction to the movie ending. Unlike Homer's Odyssey, Nolan's movie ends very shortly after the slaying of the suitors, although through various montages, voiceovers, and flash forwards or whatever they're called, Nolan packs a lot into his brief ending, and it's a very different ending to Homer's. In the movie, the battle with the suitors is a really close call. Odysseus is shot several times over and nearly dies in Penelope's arms. That's the closest the movie gets to the bedroom scene. We then see, in a flash forward, Odysseus setting off to sail to the west, perhaps for good. Whereas in the Odyssey, his final journey abroad is foreshadowed as a means of seeking absolution from Poseidon. In the movie, Odysseus' final journey is to atone for his sins against his own men. And he is joined by Penelope. And we see them sailing off literally into the sunset together. And in Nolan's movie, like the epic, the characters are painfully aware that Odysseus' slaying of the suitors cannot be without consequence. But in Nolan's Odyssey, there's no deus ex machina to absolve Odysseus. Because just before the battle with the suitors, Odysseus' guardian goddess Athena has disappeared. It turns out that the character portrayed by Zendaya was a Trojan woman, perhaps a priestess of Athene, who was slaughtered in front of Odysseus at the sack of Troy, at the very same moment as a statue of a goddess, again perhaps Athene, is desecrated. And Odysseus has been carrying that guilt around with him, along with his guilt for his lost men. It seems to some extent that Odysseus has been relieved of the guilt of the Trojan priestess, if she is that, but that leaves him without a divine patron. Nolan is, in this regard, absolutely faithful to Homer's cultural logic. With the slaying of the suitors, Odysseus has to go into exile, probably never to return. But he does so with his wife, thus managing to balance the personal homecoming with the brutal, ineluctable logic of a society in a way that Homer cannot manage without divine intervention. But whilst Odysseus and Penelope sail off into the sunset, Telemachus is left behind, crowned as the ruler of Ithaca, for he was mostly left out of the killing scene, thus escaping the vengeance cycle. And this choice makes a lot of sense to me. Both Homer's and Nolan's Odyssey focus heavily on Telemachus's maturing role as a leader of the next generation, and so it is fitting, even faithful to the Homeric spirit, to see him crowned as king. And yet the future is not too optimistic for Telemachus either. Here's where things get a little bit meta, shall we say. Throughout the movie, there have been rumors about sea peoples, a mysterious off-screen threat to society at large. One of the reasons why Penelope had to be about to remarry, if I followed it right, was so that Ithaca could unite under a stable leader, strong enough to withstand the coming onslaughts from the sea peoples. And so Telemachus is continuing the patrilineal line, but perhaps it's a dying line. The sea people are heralding a societal collapse, the end of the Bronze Age. So overall, I found the ending to Nolan's movie compact, mystic, emotionally compelling and cathartic in a way that Homer, with all due respect, just isn't. And yet, despite being so very different to the end of Homer's Odyssey, Nolan's ending is clever and faithful to the spirit and logic of Homer and his society. Nolan preserves Odysseus' spiritual homecoming in perhaps the only way that's possible without divine machinery and without destroying the cultural necessities of that world. And just like Homer, Nolan leaves plenty of room for ambiguity, sadness, and loss. Odysseus and Penelope have a happy ending of sorts, and Telemachus has grown into and assumed the mantle of manly power, but he is a man presiding over a dying civilization. Centuries of darkness will follow, and the stories of Troy will only be sung. And yet, as we all know, those songs of Troy will last.